Hello, this is Dan Nowman, and this is a special uh, presentation. I felt it was important to do this video and to show you clips from a very important landmark speech of Bernie Sanders that took place on June the 11th, 2019 at George Washington University. And while it is basically on the subject of democratic socialism, it's really so much more than that. And I felt it really important to do this special production to go into detail why it's important and to kind of discuss it a little bit in more detail. And for the most part, you would just let the clips speak for themselves. And there's been a lot of criticism to this speech, and I feel that there should be a lot of promotion of this speech so that people are aware of the incredibly important content in it and why I feel, or many others feel similarly, that it's important to be aware of this and to watch it. And of course, I will also make it available in individual clips as well, breaking it down by at least 7 different subject matters. So let's get right into this. Bernie Sanders opens his speech sounding like a politician, sounding actually very presidential, talking about the times that we live in now, how there is, he says, this isn't the time to live in despair because of all the enormous problems that are happening simultaneously. But he immediately points out that the very basic conflict of economic and political power between oligarchy and also a movement of working people and young people that are, as he says, quote, fighting for justice, economically, socially, and politically. So there have been, of course, he talks about in the introduction, he talks about the low wages that have happened since 2008, even though there's this incredible wealth and then therefore wealth inequality that's been created, the largest such thing since at least the 1920s. So you see not only an explosion in wealth and production, but an explosion in wealth inequality that's growing by leaps and bounds. He then gets into the first really important thing that I want to get into right now, the first clip, which he begins to talk about what I would call hegemony, to put all of this, what's happening in the current present moment of society, 2019 going into 2020, then the next presidency, putting it into the perspective of a historical context. So creating a sort of hegemony to connect the past with the present. So that's what this first clip is. So let's watch the first clip where he goes back to authoritarianism as it was happening in the 1930s.
The authoritarian playbook, by the way, is not new. The challenge we confront today as a nation and as a world is in many ways not different from the one we faced a little less than a century ago during and after the Great Depression of the 1930s. Then as now, deeply rooted and seemingly intractable economic and social disparities led to the rise of right-wing nationalist forces all over the world. In Europe, the anger and despair was ultimately harnessed by authoritarian demagogues who fused corporatism, nationalism, racism, and xenophobia into a political movement that amassed totalitarian power, destroyed democracy, and ultimately murdered millions of people, including members of my own family. But we must remember that those were not the only places where dark forces tried to rise up and capture power. Today, we are all rightly repulsed by the sight of neo-Nazis and Klansmen openly marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we are horrified by houses of worship being shot up by right-wing terrorists. But on February 20th, 1939, over 20,000 Nazis held a mass rally, not in Berlin, not in Rome, but in Madison Square Garden, in front of a 30-foot banner of George Washington bordered with swastikas in New York City. New York City. But back then, those American extremists could not replicate the success of their authoritarian brethren across the ocean. Because we in the United States, thank God, made a different choice than Europe did in responding to the era's social and economic crises. We rejected the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler, and we instead embraced the bold and visionary leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Together with organized labor, leaders in the African American community, and progressives inside and outside the Democratic Party, Roosevelt led a transformation of the American government and the American economy. Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today: red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering." They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred."
That was amazing to actually have someone speaking in a public forum who's running for president to point out historical references to authoritarianism in the 1930s to give us a basis for, what did happen here in the United States, and of course did not have the momentum to build like it had in Europe, particularly in Germany and Italy at the time, and to start to bring the story up to the present day. That's what you do to better educate, so that there's an understanding of the historical context. So continuing on into the next clip.
By rallying the American people, FDR and his progressive coalition created the New Deal, won 4 terms, and created an economy that worked for all and not just the few. Today, New Deal initiatives like Social Security, unemployment compensation, the right to form a union, the minimum wage, protection for farmers, regulation of Wall Street, and massive infrastructure improvements are considered pillars of American society. But while he stood up for the working families of our country, we can never forget that President Roosevelt was reviled by the oligarchs of his time, who berated these extremely popular programs as socialism. Similarly, in the 1960s, when President Lyndon Johnson brought about Medicare, Medicaid, and other extremely popular and important programs, he was also viciously attacked by the ruling class of this country. And here is the point. It is no exaggeration to state that not only did FDR's agenda improve the lives of millions of Americans, but the New Deal was enormously popular politically and helped defeat far-right extremism. For a time. Today, America and the world are once again moving toward authoritarianism, and the same right-wing forces of oligarchy, corporatism, nationalism, racism, and xenophobia are on the march, pushing us to make the apocalyptically wrong choice that Europe made in the last century. Today, we now see a handful of billionaires with unprecedented wealth and power. We see huge private monopolies operating outside of any real democratic oversight and often subsidized by taxpayers, with the power to control almost every aspect of our lives. They are the profit-taking gatekeepers of our healthcare, our technology, our finance system, our food supply, and almost all of the other basic necessities of life. And let us name them. They are Wall Street, the insurance companies, the drug companies, the fossil fuel industry, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, and giant agribusiness. They are the entities with unlimited wealth who surround our nation's capital with thousands of well-paid lobbyists who, to a very significant degree, write the laws that we live under. Today, we have a demagogue in the White House who, for cheap political gain, is attempting to deflect the attention of the American people away from the real crises that we face, and instead is doing what demagogues always do, and that is to divide people up and legislate hatred. This is a president who supports brutal family separations, border walls, Muslim bans, anti-LGBT policies, deportations, and voter suppression. It is my very strong belief that the United States must reject that path of hatred and divisiveness and instead find the moral conviction to choose a different path, a higher path, a path of compassion, justice, and love. And that is the path that I call democratic socialism.
This is the first part of the speech where Bernie really begins to talk about what democratic socialism obviously means to him. And again, he very brilliantly ties it, the past in with the present, and talks about how the right-wing extremism, the fascism, the corporatism, oligarchy, wealth inequality, how that really was addressed with the creation of the New Deal. And that required a coalition being built so that could actually be implemented. And then he creates the initial foundation and the basis of what he thinks democratic socialism is, which is basically compassion, justice, and love. So in this next clip, he talks about the fact that we need the mission of the Democratic Party, or let's say our mission just as human beings here in the United States, is to finish the New Deal, finish what FDR started.
Over 80 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped create a government that made transformative progress in protecting the needs of working families. Today, in the second decade of the 21st century, we must take up the unfinished business of the New Deal and carry it to completion. This is the unfinished business of the Democratic Party and the vision we together must accomplish. In order to accomplish that goal, it means committing ourselves to protecting political rights, to protecting civil rights, and to protect economic rights for all of the people in our country. As FDR stated in his 1944 State of the Union address, and I quote, "We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence," end quote. Today, our Bill of Rights guarantees the American people a number of important constitutionally protected political rights. And while we understand that these rights have not always been respected, and we have so much work to do in order to protect those rights, we are proud that our Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, a free press, and other rights, because we understand that we can never have true American freedom unless we are free from authoritarian tyranny. But now we must take the next step forward and guarantee every man, woman, and child in our country basic economic rights, the right to quality health care, the right to as much education as one needs to succeed in our society, the right to a good job that pays a living wage, the right to affordable housing, the right to a secure retirement, and the right to live in a clean environment. We must recognize that in the 21st century, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, economic rights are human rights. And that is what I mean by democratic socialism.
So he continues going into even more detail about what democratic socialism means to him by focusing, again, bringing historical perspective into the current day with the original Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the freedom of the press, etc., and how important this is. And even though there are groups that have tried to evade this and threaten it, it still is something that we have inside the U.S. Constitution. So he also talks about the need for not only these kinds of rights, but economic justice.
As one of the great leaders in American history, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I quote, "Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all of God's children," end quote. To realize this vision, we must not view America only as a population of disconnected individuals. We must also view ourselves as part of, and I quote, "an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny," end quote, as Dr. King put it. In other words, we are in this together. We must see ourselves as part of one nation, one community, and one society, regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or country of origin. This quintessentially American idea is literally emblazoned on our coins. E pluribus unum, from the many, one. And I should tell you, it is enshrined in the motto of our campaign for the presidency, not me, us. Let me be clear. I do understand that I and other progressives will face massive attacks from those who attempt to use the word socialism as a slur. But I should also tell you that I have faced and overcome these attacks for decades, and I am not the only one. Let us remember that in 1932, Republican President Herbert Hoover claimed that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was, quote, "a disguise for the totalitarian state," end quote. In 1936, former Democratic New York governor and Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith said in a speech about FDR's New Deal policies, quote, "Just get the platform of the Democratic Party and get the platform of the Socialist Party and lay them down on your dining room table side by side," end quote. When President Harry Truman proposed a national health care program, the American Medical Association hired Ronald Reagan as their pitchman. The AMA called the legislation that stemmed from Truman's proposal, quote, "socialized medicine," claiming that White House staff were, quote, "followers of the Moscow party line," end quote. In 1960, Ronald Reagan, in a letter to Richard Nixon, wrote the following about John F. Kennedy, quote, "Under the tousled boyish haircut is still old Karl Marx," end quote. In the 1990s, then Congressman Newt Gingrich claimed President Bill Clinton's health care plan was, quote, "centralized bureaucratic socialism." The Conservative Heritage Foundation has claimed that the Children's Health Insurance Program, the CHIP program, was, quote, a step toward socialism. Former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, claimed the stimulus package, the omnibus spending bill, and the budget proposed by President Obama were all one big down payment on a new American socialist experiment. In this regard, President Harry Truman was right. And listen to what he said. Truman said, and I quote, "Socialism is the epithet they have hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years. And this is Truman. This is a quote from Harry Truman. Socialism is what they called Social Security. Socialism is what they called farm price supports. Socialism is what they called bank deposit insurance. Socialism is what they called the growth of free and independent labor organizations. Socialism is their name for almost anything that helps all of the people, end quote, Harry Truman.
Going back in history, again, he always puts it in the context of historical references and then makes comparison to the present day. The criticisms that we hear of socialism, where most people I often talk to will say, if they're critics of socialism, they won't hesitate a second to criticize. But I don't ever really hear them saying there's such a thing as a critique of capitalism. Or if there is, it'll just be fixed with some kind of reform and not really even trying to break that down and analyze it further. But again, brilliantly, Bernie talks about all the criticism there was of the New Deal program, how it was even associated with the Moscow Party and red baiting and the beginnings of socialism and the new socialism experiment. All kinds of references going all the way back to the New Deal and bringing them up to date, showing how it's the same old narrative that tries to eliminate any interest, or at the very least marginalize the purpose of socialism, basically, or programs that benefit the workers. The next clip is a more recent history lesson going back to 2008 and the economic crash, and talking about how this is unfettered capitalism in modern day terms, and how essentially the reason why we have so many economic issues for the 99%, many who are obviously in the 21st century are living paycheck to paycheck, a lot of low-wage jobs. Even though there's a lot of wealth that's created, it isn't distributed very well, so that the vast majority of it is going to the 1%, a terminology that came out of the Occupy movement. And at the beginning, actually, there's a few statistics here that I wanted to point out, where he mentions 3 families control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population here in the United States, and that means that's 160 million people. The top 1% have more wealth than the bottom 92% in the United States. 49% of all new wealth, or all new income, I should say, goes to the top 1%. So at the next clip, he basically elaborates on that in the current context, going back to a crisis that started, of course, as we all know, in 2008, where the vast majority of people, after the banks got bailed out, really got little or zero economic recovery.
Now, let us be very clear. While President Trump and his fellow oligarchs attack us for our support of democratic socialism, they don't really oppose all forms of socialism. They may hate democratic socialism because it benefits working people, but they absolutely love corporate socialism that enriches Trump and other billionaires. Let us never forget the unbelievable hypocrisy of Wall Street, the high priests of unfettered capitalism. In 2008, after their greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior created the worst financial disaster since the Great Depression, with millions of Americans losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing their life savings, Wall Street's religious adherence to unfettered capitalism suddenly came to an end. Overnight, Wall Street became big government socialists and begged for the largest federal bailout in American history, some $700 billion from the Treasury and trillions in support from the Federal Reserve. But it's not just Wall Street that loves socialism when it works for them. It is the norm across the entire corporate world. The truth is, corporate America receives hundreds of billions of dollars in federal support every single year, while these very same people are trying to cut programs that benefit ordinary Americans. If you are a fossil fuel company whose carbon emissions are destroying the planet, you get billions in government subsidies, including special tax breaks, royalty relief, funding for research and development, and numerous tax loopholes. If you are a pharmaceutical company, you make huge profits on patent rights for medicines that were developed with taxpayer-funded research. If you are a monopoly like Amazon, owned by the wealthiest person in America, you get hundreds of millions of dollars in economic incentives from taxpayers to build warehouses, and you end up paying not one penny in federal income taxes. If you are the Walton family, the wealthiest family in America, you get massive government subsidies because your low-wage workers are forced to rely on food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing in order to survive, all paid for by taxpayers. If you are the Trump family, you got $885 million worth of tax breaks and subsidies for your family's housing empire that was built on racial discrimination. When Trump screams socialism, all of his hypocrisy will not be lost on the American people. Americans will know that he is attacking all that we take for granted, from Social Security to Medicare to veterans' health care to roads and bridges to public schools to national parks to clean water and clean air. When Trump attacks socialism, I am reminded again of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor," end quote.
And of course, very cleverly says that, the oligarchs and the President Trump, when they say they don't like socialism or they hate socialism or however they put it, it's the socialism that benefits the working class, the working people. They love what Bernie called the corporate socialism, which really many of us have known that's really just another way of saying corporate subsidies, tax cuts, and things like that, benefits from the government that you technically could call socialism. It's just that they don't really benefit the working people. And in this next clip, he again goes into more detail about what democratic socialism means to him in the context of defining real freedom.
What I believe is that the American people deserve freedom, true freedom. Freedom is an often used word, but it is time that we took a hard look at what that word actually means. Ask yourself, what does it really mean to be free? Are you truly free if you are unable to go to a doctor when you are sick, or face financial bankruptcy when you leave the hospital? Are you truly free if you cannot afford the prescription drugs you need in order to stay alive? Are you truly free when you spend half of your limited income on housing and are forced to borrow money from a payday lender at 200% interest rates? Are you truly free if you are 70 years old and forced to work because you lack a pension or enough money to retire? Are you truly free if you are unable to go to a college or a trade school because your family lacks the income? Are you truly free if you are forced to work 60 or 80 hours a week because you cannot find a job that pays you a living wage? Are you truly free if you are a mother with a newborn baby, but you are forced to go back to work immediately after the birth of that child because you lack paid family leave? Are you truly free if you are a small business owner or a family farmer who is driven out of business by the monopolistic practices of big business? Are you truly free if you are a veteran who has put his or her life on the line to defend this country and tonight will be sleeping out on the streets? To me, the answer to those questions in the wealthiest nation on earth is no. Under those conditions, you are not truly free. While the Bill of Rights protects us from the tyranny of an oppressive government, many in the establishment would like the American people to submit to the tyranny of oligarchs, multinational corporations, Wall Street banks, and billionaires. It is time, and in fact, time long overdue, for the American people to stand up and fight for their right to freedom, human dignity, and security. And that is the core of what my politics and what this campaign is all about.
And of course, this is a political speech, and it's given at an educational institution called George Washington University there in Washington, D.C. But what better way to build up this speech but to focus on what continues to finish the New Deal, the second Bill of Rights that was first introduced by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, basically reiterating a lot of what Bernie's platform and what he's lived his whole life to achieve for not only the human rights of the original Bill of Rights, but the economic rights, which include healthcare, which include education, which include guaranteed jobs, which include guaranteed education, which guarantees a clean environment, which guarantees a secure retirement. The kinds of things in the context of the 21st century, much of which really applied also to FDR's time, but of course he didn't have a chance to implement them. So in the final clip, in the build-up to the end, this is his discussion which is the first time I've heard it, perhaps discussed in my lifetime by a presidential candidate in a public space like this, focusing on a 21st century version of an economic Bill of Rights.
In 1944, FDR proposed an economic Bill of Rights, but he died a year later and was never able to fulfill that vision. Our job, 75 years later, is to complete what Roosevelt started. And that is why today I am proposing a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights that establishes once and for all that every American, regardless of his or her income, is entitled to the right to a decent job that pays a living wage, the right to quality health care, the right to a complete education, the right to affordable housing, the right to a clean environment, and the right to a secure retirement. Over the course of this election, my campaign has been releasing and will continue to release detailed proposals addressing each of these yet-to-be-realized economic rights. We will also address the attacks that are being launched every day against the civil rights and civil liberties of our people. And let me be absolutely clear. Democratic socialism means, to me, requiring and achieving political and economic freedom in every community in this country. And let me be very, very clear as well when I state that the only way we achieve these goals is through a political revolution. A revolution in which millions of people get involved in the political process and reclaim our democracy by having the courage to take on the powerful corporate interests whose greed is destroying the social and economic fabric of our country. At the end of the day, the 1% may have enormous wealth and enormous power, but they are just 1%. When the 99% stand together, we can transform society. My friends, these are my values, and that is why I call myself a democratic socialist. At its core is a deep and abiding faith in the American people to peacefully and democratically enact the transformative change that will create shared prosperity, social equality, and true freedom for all. Thank you very much.
The reason why I am producing this presentation, this special presentation, is, as I said at the beginning, I think this is extraordinarily important information at this juncture of U.S. history to understand that this kind of content is coming out of the mouth of a front-running presidential candidate. And there's a lot of speculation about how popular he is, but as many saw in 2015 and 2016, he still can attract tens of thousands of people, let's say here in Los Angeles on a weekend day, and even in the middle of the week, the size of people that show up at rallies on work days is extraordinarily impressive. The enthusiasm is equal to what we saw in 2015, 2016, because it's the message. the message contained in this content that people are responding to. It's not so much Bernie the personality. Now that might look like that's what's going on the surface, but what really is bringing people out, what's really getting people's attention and getting them to respond the way that they do is the actual content of what he's talking about, that we really do need economic justice for the masses of people. We really do need to develop a hegemony of historical context showing how things have changed or showing how things haven't changed and what we need to do going forward. And he's absolutely right, and I will go back to this again myself as I have on my television show, that millions of people must stand together and demand these changes. That's the only way that this is going to happen, because the 99% does represent the vast majority of people, no matter where you are in the world. And by the way, Bernie also talks about the fact that this economic justice is challenged by fascist right-wing movements all over the world. It's not just here in the United States. So it was a brilliant way in that speech of creating a historic hegemony with what was happening in the past, most specifically since the last time we had a major crash and an economic crisis, the worst one in the history of the country in 1929 and into the 30s, and taking a lot of the developments at that time, what was happening, and making comparisons to what are going on now in the early 21st century, and then addressing how FDR began to actually find those solutions and address them and created a coalition of people to get things in motion. And it did stop to some extent, and for a while, the growing wealth inequality that was pervasive at that time, which we are now seeing again. So again, millions of people must stand together and demand the changes that need to be made is a correct statement. So Bernie Sanders, again, as he has been throughout most of his life, through most of his issues, of course, we all can have disagreements, but from a historical context and what's going on, identifying problems now and solutions going forward, Bernie Sanders continues to be on the right side of history. So it's important that you get that information out there. So if you come across information that marginalizes this, ignores this is the information, this is the news you really need to hear. This is why I've done this special presentation today, and I hope you can share it far and wide. I will make individual clips of the individual topics. And this is an ongoing discussion also on the Nowman show. And again, my name is Dan Nowman, host of the Nowman show. Thank you for tuning in to this special presentation. Bernie Sanders' speech at George Washington University on June 11th, 2019 on the subject of what democratic socialism means to him, as not only as food for thought, but an educational experience. Thank you again. Stay present in the moment always. Take care.